Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent, and sometimes it needs no words to be understood. What happened today will not be forgotten, and the lesson will live on far beyond this park. What do you think about what unfolded? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible story. Jean-Claude continued his walk, passing under the dim glow of streetlights as he neared the edge of the park. A few people still watched him, their gazes filled with something that was not fear, nor admiration, but understanding. They had seen something today that could not be easily explained. They had witnessed the quiet power of a man who did not need to prove his strength, because it had already been known. They had seen what it looked like when force met something greater: control. The pigeons had returned to the base of the oak tree, pecking at the last of the crumbs. Life, as it always did, moved forward. The world did not pause for the pride of one man or the silence of another. It continued, indifferent and unshaken. The senior officer finally turned away, nodding to the younger cop who still looked uncertain, still processing the reality of what had happened. Without another word, they moved back toward their patrol car. There was nothing more to do. No arrests, no reports. The matter had already resolved itself. Justice had been served, not by force, but by consequence. Jean-Claude reached the end of the park, stepping onto the quiet sidewalk. The streetlights flickered on, casting their glow against the pavement. The city stretched before him, vast and waiting, filled with 1,000 other stories that would unfold without his presence. He had come to the park for peace, and peace in its way had returned. He had changed nothing. He had simply been there when the moment needed him. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He did not look back. Because there was nothing left to see. Because justice, when it is real, does not need an audience. Because power, when it is true, does not need to speak. And as the night embraced the city, Jean-Claude Van Damme disappeared into the darkness, his shadow stretching long behind him, a quiet echo of the lesson he had left behind. The senior officer, still watching him, finally spoke, his voice low but firm, just enough for the younger cop to hear. "Let him go." The younger officer hesitated for only a second, then gave a short nod. He didn't fully understand, but he trusted the older man's judgment. Jean-Claude had not resisted. He had not attacked. And yet, he had left behind something far greater than any act of violence ever could. Jean-Claude stepped onto the sidewalk beyond the park, his shadow stretching long across the pavement as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon. He did not look back. There was nothing left to see. No reason to stay. The moment had ended exactly as it was meant to. The senior officer finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned his gaze back to the badge and firearm in his hands, feeling the weight of what they represented. This was not a moment that would be forgotten, not by the people who had witnessed it, not by Carlyle, and certainly not by him. The footage from the phones would spread. The story would take on a life of its own. But no video, no headline, no public reaction would ever truly capture what had happened here. Because some lessons are not about words. Some moments cannot be explained. And power, real power, is never about force. It is about knowing when it is not needed at all. The last traces of sunlight faded as twilight settled over the park, casting long shadows across the winding paths and towering oak trees. The warm summer breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and the distant laughter of children. a stark contrast to the silent storm that had unfolded beneath the old oak tree. Jean-Claude Van Damme moved with the same effortless grace that had defined him from the beginning, his steps steady, unhurried, as if untouched by the weight of what had transpired. He did not need to look back. The past was behind him, and he had no interest in carrying it forward. Behind him, the park slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The murmurs of the crowd had died down, their curiosity satisfied, their footage saved and ready to be shared. Some would spread the video for entertainment, others as evidence of justice served, and some would analyze every moment, searching for meaning in what they had witnessed. But Jean-Claude did not concern himself with how the world would interpret what had happened. Truth was not dictated by headlines or phone screens. Truth lived in the eyes of those who had been there. The senior officer, still holding Carlyle's badge and firearm, exhaled heavily. He had seen many things in his years behind the badge: anger, violence, injustice, and the ugly consequences of power misused. But this was different. This was not a fight, not a confrontation, but a reckoning, a lesson taught without words, without force, without bloodshed. Carlyle had undone himself, stripped bare by his own arrogance, by his own belief that his authority was absolute. And now he had nothing left. Carlyle himself was gone, his retreat a silent admission of defeat. There had been no resistance, no final stand, only the heavy realization that he had destroyed himself in front of an audience that would not forget. His boots had once carried him through this park with confidence, with command, but now they carried only the weight of his own downfall. His name, his career, his reputation, all of it had been reduced to a viral clip that the world would dissect, replay, and judge. He had not been beaten. He had been dismissed. And that was far worse. The movement, smooth and effortless, lifted the last traces of tension from the air. It was as if the final note of an unspoken symphony had been played, signaling the end of something larger than the confrontation itself. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to disperse. Conversations resumed, though hushed, and the glow of phone screens slowly dimmed. A few lingered, unwilling to look away just yet, but the spectacle, the fire that had drawn them in, was dying down. Carlyle had long disappeared into the distance, his shadow stretching behind him as he left the park that had once been his territory. His authority, his power, had been erased in the span of minutes, and he would not return. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. The senior officer turned back to Jean-Claude one last time, his grip still firm on the surrendered badge in his palm. There was something unspoken in his gaze, something that might have been gratitude or perhaps understanding. Jean-Claude did not look away, did not shift under the weight of it. He simply acknowledged it, and then, just as quietly as he had come, he walked away. His steps were steady, unhurried, leaving behind only the echoes of what had happened. He did not look back. There was nothing left to see. The park, washed in the fading amber light of the setting sun, reclaimed its peace. The air, once thick with conflict, felt light once more. Children laughed. The wind rustled the trees. Life, as it always did, moved forward. And the earth beneath the old oak tree held the memory of a battle not fought with fists, but with something far greater. The quiet dismantling of a man who had mistaken force for power, and the silent lesson of one who had never needed either to win. The evening air settled over the park as the last remnants of tension faded into the warm glow of the setting sun. Jean-Claude Van Damme walked with the same steady, effortless grace he had carried throughout the entire ordeal. His steps were measured, purposeful, yet completely unhurried. There was no weight of victory on his shoulders, no need to revel in what had transpired. The moment had passed, and to him it required no further thought. He had done nothing more than exist within it, allowing nature to take its course. The people around him, however, had not yet fully moved on. The crowd, though dissipating, still carried murmurs of what they had just witnessed. Some exchanged hushed words. Others scrolled through the footage on their phones, already crafting their own narratives. A few still stood in stunned silence, trying to process how a single man had unraveled an officer's entire career without ever throwing a punch. Some saw it as justice, others as a spectacle, and a few, deep down, as a reminder that power was not always where they had been told it was. The senior officer, still gripping Carlyle's surrendered badge and firearm, exhaled slowly. He watched Jean-Claude as he walked, his expression unreadable. There was something about the man, something beyond what had just happened. He wasn't just some bystander who had been caught up in an unfortunate moment. He was something else. The way he moved, the way he reacted, the way he had controlled the situation without ever raising his voice. It was not something learned by accident. It was the mark of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering control, not just of his body, but of everything around him. The senior officer had seen violence before, real violence, the kind that left scars. This was not that. This had been something colder, sharper. The quiet dismantling of a man who had believed himself untouchable. The younger officer still looked uncertain, his posture tense as if waiting for an order that never came. He had been trained to see things in absolutes. A man who disarmed a cop should be a threat. A man who humiliated an officer should be taken in. But none of this had played out the way his training told him it should. The senior officer had made his judgment, and that was final. And so, with reluctant acceptance, the younger cop let his hand relax away from his belt. Jean-Claude reached the edge of the park, his pace never shifting, never slowing. A few pigeons had returned to where he had sat, pecking lazily at the last remaining crumbs. The world, it seemed, had already moved on. The wind carried the distant sound of laughter, the hum of conversation, the occasional bark of a dog. The natural rhythm of the park had resumed. "That's enough," the officer repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Stand down, Carlyle." The use of his last name, stripped of rank, hit harder than any reprimand. It was not an order from a superior, it was a judgment. And Carlyle knew, in that moment, that he had lost more than just control. He had lost everything. The older officer's next words came quiet but absolute. "Give me your badge." The park, the world itself, seemed to narrow to a single, unbearable point. The silence that followed was suffocating. Carlyle's face twisted, his chest heaving as he stared at the man before him. His lips parted, but no words came. He searched for something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing left. The older officer didn't move, his gaze steady, unyielding. Badge and gun. The finality in his voice crushed the air from Carlyle's lungs. His fingers, stiff and trembling, reached up to his chest. His badge, the symbol of everything he was, everything he had built his authority upon, now felt like a weight dragging him down. For a breath, one long, endless breath, he hesitated. Then, with a motion that felt like breaking, he unpinned the badge. It glinted briefly in the evening light, a dying ember, before landing in the older officer's palm with a hollow, final sound. The gun followed, its weight surrendered without a fight. The world around them did not move. The wind rustled the trees. The distant laughter of children echoed through the air. Life continued, indifferent to the ruin of one man's pride. The older officer studied the items in his hand for a brief moment before looking up at Carlyle one last time. His voice was quiet, almost kind. "Go home, Dan." Carlyle's body remained rigid for a few seconds more, his fists clenched, his jaw locked. But there was nothing left to fight for. His eyes burned as he turned away, his steps heavy, his breath shallow. The crowd parted as he walked, their eyes following him, their phones still capturing his fall. He felt their judgment like a brand searing into his skin. His authority was gone. His career was gone. And soon the world would know it too. He did not look back, because there was nothing left to see. Carlyle's steps were heavy as he walked away, the weight of his own disgrace pressing down on him like an anchor. His badge and gun were gone, his authority stripped in front of the people he had once commanded without question. The world around him seemed distant, muffled, as if he had been removed from it entirely. The judgment in the eyes of the bystanders burned hotter than any sun. The realization that his failure was now immortalized in countless phone recordings sent a cold wave of nausea through him. He had always thought himself untouchable. Now he was nothing. Jean-Claude Van Damme still stood exactly where he had been, his expression calm, unchanged. He had not gloated, had not celebrated his quiet victory. He had simply existed within the moment, allowing Carlyle to destroy himself with his own choices. There was something almost poetic in the way he had dismantled a man without ever throwing a punch. The air around him carried no tension, no malice, only the unwavering presence of someone who had seen this kind of downfall before. He did not have to strike Carlyle down. The man had done it to himself. The older officer, still holding Carlyle's surrendered badge and weapon, turned his attention back to Jean-Claude. The younger officer beside him still looked tense, still carried the weight of his training that told him a man like this, one who had just disarmed a cop with effortless ease, should be treated as a threat. But the senior officer understood differently. He saw what had truly happened. He had seen violence before, had seen men who sought to dominate and those who refused to submit. Jean-Claude Van Damme had not resisted. He had not fought. He had only stood his ground in a way that made force irrelevant. The senior officer took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" His voice was measured, respectful, not a command, but a question. Jean-Claude's gaze met his, steady and clear. For a moment, he didn't respond, as if weighing the intent behind the words. Then, finally, he gave a single, slow nod. A simple acknowledgement. Nothing more. The officer studied him for another beat, then exhaled slowly. He had already made his decision. He turned slightly, motioning to the discarded baton and firearm still lying on the pavement. "Would you be willing to stay and make a statement?" Again, Jean-Claude did not answer immediately. His gaze flickered to the weapons, then back to the officer. Another pause, one that stretched just long enough for the younger cop to shift uncomfortably. It was as if Van Damme was not just deciding whether to comply, but whether the request itself was necessary. And then, without a word, he stood. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, threading through the thick summer air like an approaching storm. The tension in the park became unbearable, pressing against the silence like a heavy weight. Carlyle stood rigid, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, his mind racing to find a way to salvage the situation before his backup arrived. His grip flexed and unflexed near his empty holster, the absence of his baton and firearm like a missing limb. The reality of it gnawed at him. He had lost both weapons, but more importantly, he had lost control. His authority, the thing he had relied on for years, had slipped from his grasp in mere moments, and now he had no choice but to wait for his fellow officers to arrive and see it for themselves. Jean-Claude Van Damme still had not moved. He sat in the same position, his expression as calm as it had been from the beginning. There was no gloating, no aggression, nothing that Carlyle could latch onto to justify his actions. He had struck first, and he had failed. That truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The gathered crowd, still growing, whispered among themselves, their phones capturing every second. Some wore expressions of shock, others amusement, and a few disappointment. The shame of it twisted in Carlyle's gut, sharp and suffocating. He had never felt this way before, never stood in the center of a moment he couldn't control. The sirens reached the park entrance, the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the golden hues of the evening. The tension in the air snapped even tighter as a patrol car rolled onto the grass, tires crunching against the earth. Two doors opened simultaneously. The first officer to step out was young, sharp-eyed, his posture stiff with alertness. The second was older, seasoned, his face lined with years of experience. The younger officer's hand hovered near his belt as he took in the scene. The scattered weapons on the pavement, the frozen expressions on the bystanders, Carlyle's rigid stance, and the still-seated man at the center of it all. The older officer, however, did not move with the same urgency. His gaze was calculating, sweeping over the situation in a single, practiced motion. His eyes flicked from Carlyle to Van Damme, then to the baton and firearm lying discarded on the ground. His brow furrowed slightly, the gears turning in his mind. Something wasn't adding up. The younger officer was the first to speak, his voice firm but uncertain. "Sir, hands where we can see them." Jean-Claude didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his gaze meeting the younger officer's with an unreadable patience. Then, with deliberate ease, he raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but in understanding. He was not resisting. He never had been. Carlyle seized the moment, his voice raw with desperation and authority. "He assaulted an officer. He disarmed me. I need him in cuffs now." The words came out sharp, an attempt to reframe the narrative, to take back control of a moment that had long since slipped through his fingers. His face burned with the weight of eyes watching him, judging him, and he clung to the last shreds of his authority. But the older officer didn't react the way Carlyle expected. He didn't move toward Van Damme. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't even reach for his radio. Instead, he simply looked at Carlyle, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice steady and final, he spoke one word: "No." The impact of that single syllable hit harder than any blow. Carlyle's breath hitched, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. His face twisted in disbelief. "What do you mean, no? You saw what happened. I saw," the older officer interrupted, his tone even but weighted. "I saw everything I needed to." His eyes moved back to Jean-Claude, assessing him with a sharpness that suggested understanding. A flicker of something passed through his expression, recognition, perhaps, not of a criminal, but of a man who was more than he appeared to be. Carlyle felt the ground shift beneath him, the last threads of his authority unraveling. His heart pounded, his hands shaken at his sides. He had expected backup to fix this, to restore the order he had lost. Instead, he was being judged, not just by the crowd, but by his own fellow officers. His fingers twitched. His body screamed for action, for something, anything, that would pull him out of this downward spiral. His pride burned hot and desperate, and without thinking, without deciding, his hand moved. The older officer's voice cut through the thick air before Carlyle could do anything. "That's enough." The words weren't loud, but they carried an authority that couldn't be ignored. The kind of authority that came from experience, from wisdom, from knowing when a situation had already played itself out. Carlyle's mouth opened, his rage barely contained. To his disgrace. Carlyle's chest heaved, his breath shallow with the sting of public humiliation. He had spent years ensuring moments like this never happened to him. Yet here he was, stripped bare in front of strangers, his authority hanging by a thread. His mind screamed for action. He could still turn this around. He could still make this right. But the truth gnawed at him. There was no undoing what had just happened. Jean-Claude remained seated, his expression unreadable, his posture as relaxed as it had been from the beginning. There was no triumph in his face, no arrogance, only quiet patience. He was waiting, not in challenge, but in understanding, waiting to see what Carlyle would do next. The officer's body tensed, his fingers ghosting over the firearm at his hip. A familiar comfort, a familiar tool. His mind raced through justifications. If he drew the gun, he could frame this as self-defense. The man was resisting. The man was a threat. The man had, what? Deflected a baton strike? Taken nothing? Fought no one? The reality of the situation set in like a stone sinking in his gut. He had struck first, and he had lost. The distant laughter of children played against the edges of the scene, a cruel reminder that the world was still moving, that life had not stopped for his bruised ego. The tension in his muscles screamed for release. His pride burned hotter than the summer sun. And still, Van Damme sat, unmoved, his presence forcing Carlyle to confront a truth he had never had to face before. He was powerless. A murmur rippled through the crowd, subtle but present. Someone whispered. Another chuckled under their breath. The shame of it scorched deeper than any physical blow ever could. Carlyle's breath turned ragged. He couldn't let it end like this. He wouldn't. His hand, shaking but resolute, pressed the button on his radio. His voice, raw with desperation, cut through the heavy silence. "Officer needs assistance. Immediate backup." The words sent a shockwave through the atmosphere. The moment they left his lips, the dynamic shifted. The murmurs grew louder, uncertainty rippling through the onlookers. Van Damme's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture changed. Subtle, but there. A silent acknowledgement. The officer had made his choice. And with that choice, the path forward had been set. Carlyle straightened, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, as the distant wail of sirens began to weave through the air. The sound was faint but growing, a high-pitched promise of incoming reinforcements. His backup would arrive soon. He clung to that thought, to the belief that with more uniforms on the scene, the balance of power would shift back in his favor. But then, a new realization took hold. The crowd had already judged him. The video footage had already been recorded. The baton on the ground, his failed strike, the effortless disarmament. It was all there, frozen in time, impossible to erase. And the man before him, the one he had deemed a threat, had done nothing. The weight of his mistake settled heavy in his chest, pressing down with an unbearable force. His jaw clenched. His pulse roared in his ears, but still he stood his ground, waiting for the sirens to close the distance, waiting for someone to save him from the moment he had created. Instant. The baton moved. It came down, hard and fast, aimed for the shoulder, an attack designed to hurt but not maim. A correction, a lesson, a warning. But it did not land. In the blink of an eye, Jean-Claude shifted, not with panic, not with flinching hesitation, but with precise, calculated ease. The baton met nothing but air, slicing through the empty space where his body had been. It was as if he had predicted the strike before it had even begun. The force of the missed blow sent a sharp vibration up Carlyle's arm, the shock of the impact against the empty air rattling his wrist. His brain barely had time to register the failure before he adjusted, redirecting the weapon in a controlled backswing toward Van Damme's side. It never made it. Jean-Claude's hand shot up impossibly fast, seizing the baton mid-motion. His grip was like steel, an unyielding force that froze the weapon in place. The energy Carlyle had put into the swing was stopped dead, the sudden lack of motion sending a jolt through his arm. Carlyle's heart pounded, confusion flashing across his features. No one had ever stopped him like this. No one had ever dared. A ripple of disbelief swept through the small crowd gathering nearby. Someone let out a hushed curse under their breath. A teenager in the back raised his phone, the screen already recording. For the first time, Carlyle felt the weight of eyes on him, not in fear, but in expectation. They were watching, not for his authority, but for what would happen next. Carlyle gritted his teeth, tightening his grip, trying to yank the baton free, but it did not move. Jean-Claude, still seated, still calm, merely held it. No tension, no struggle, just an immovable grip. Carlyle yanked again, harder this time, but the baton remained firmly in Van Damme's possession. A beat passed, the world holding its breath, and then, in the simplest of movements, Jean-Claude released it. The baton clattered onto the pavement between them, rolling once before settling in the dirt. A thick silence followed, heavier than before. Carlyle's ears burned with the heat of his own humiliation, his chest rising and falling in short, sharp breaths. The phones were still recording. The witnesses were still watching. Carlyle had struck first, and he had failed. Jean-Claude had not hit him, had not fought back, had not even stood up. Yet somehow Carlyle had already lost. His pride screamed for retaliation, for action, for something to reclaim the moment that had spiraled out of his control. His fingers twitched toward his belt, instinct reaching for the next tool in his arsenal. The weight of his service weapon pressed into his palm, familiar, reassuring. Jean-Claude's eyes flicked to the movement, but his expression did not change. Carlyle's mind spun. If he drew the gun, the moment would shift irreversibly. If he drew the gun, he could take back control. If he drew the gun, he could win. But something in Jean-Claude's gaze, steady, patient, unshaken, made him hesitate. And in that hesitation, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The onlookers had seen it all: the baton, the miss, the effortless disarmament. They had already made their judgment. His fingers hovered near the gun. A single thought pulsed in his mind. This is not how it was supposed to go. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, wrapping around Carlyle like a noose. His fingers twitched near his belt, where the weight of his firearm rested against his hip. The urge to reclaim control, to rewrite the narrative clawed at his pride, but deep in his gut, something cold and sharp twisted. The man in front of him, Jean-Claude Van Damme, had not fought back, had not hit him, had not even raised his voice. And yet, Carlyle stood in the center of a moment that had already slipped through his grasp. The baton lay abandoned between them, a symbol of his failure. The gathered crowd, silent yet undeniably present, held their collective breath. Phones were raised, their small screens glowing like digital witnesses. As the officer reached the bench, his shadow fell over Van Damme, casting half his face in shadow. The pigeons at his feet scattered, their wings flapping noisily in the sudden shift of energy. Jean-Claude did not react. He did not tense. He did not adjust his posture. He remained exactly as he was, relaxed, at ease, as if the officer standing over him was no more significant than the shifting breeze. Carlyle inhaled slowly, irritation flickering beneath his professional mask. He was used to people adjusting themselves in his presence. A nervous shift, a quick explanation, submissive compliance. This man did nothing. No recognition, no apology, no obedience. The air between them thickened. The surrounding sounds of the park seemed to muffle under the weight of unspoken tension. Carlyle's voice was clipped and cold, designed to cut through any atmosphere and demand response. "You got a reason to be sitting here?" Still, Jean-Claude did not move. His grip on the protein bar remained the same, his gaze still resting on the park as if the officer had not spoken. Carlyle's patience, never deep to begin with, thinned. He shifted his stance, his boots grinding subtly against the pavement. The fingers of his right hand flexed once against the baton handle. He didn't enjoy escalating situations without cause, but he never hesitated when cause presented itself. The sun continued its slow descent, the golden hues deepening into early evening. Shadows stretched across the paths, but within the small circle where they stood, one seated, one standing, the air remained charged, thick with something unseen but inevitable. The park, oblivious to the storm brewing within it, continued its gentle symphony. Children laughed, birds chirped, leaves rustled in the summer breeze, but those closest, those who had stopped mid-walk, mid-conversation, felt it. That subtle shift in the air. The crackle before the lightning. The stillness before the thunder. And so, beneath the waning sun, the first silent chord of confrontation was struck. The park watched. The earth held its breath. And the air grew thick with the promise that something, once started, could never be undone. Carlyle's patience cracked like a brittle shell, the silence between them stretching too long, too heavy. He had expected the man to answer, to acknowledge him, to react in some way. But Jean-Claude Van Damme remained as he was, still and unreadable, his body language offering nothing for Carlyle to grasp. The officer shifted his stance again, his boots grinding against the pavement, his fingers now resting deliberately against the baton at his side. "I asked you a question," Carlyle said, his voice sharper this time, cutting through the thick summer air. "What are you doing here?" Jean-Claude finally moved, but only slightly. His hand reached into his hoodie pocket, slow, deliberate. For a brief second, Carlyle's muscles tensed, instinct screaming that a weapon could emerge, but all Van Damme produced was the remaining piece of his protein bar. He broke it cleanly in two, letting one half fall to the ground, where a single pigeon cautiously returned to claim it. Carlyle's jaw tightened. The act wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even disrespectful, but something about it gnawed at his nerves. It was the sheer casualness of it, as if the presence of an armed officer meant nothing, as if Van Damme was entertaining himself rather than responding to authority. "You've been sitting here long?" Carlyle pressed, determined to break through the man's quiet defiance. "You live around here?" Jean-Claude chewed slowly, his gaze drifting lazily across the park, never quite meeting Carlyle's. It was as if he had all the time in the world, as if this conversation was happening on his terms and not the officer's. Carlyle's patience, already razor-thin, snapped. His hand closed around the baton, pulling it from his belt in a smooth, practiced motion. The sight of the weapon drew immediate attention from those nearby. A young woman walking her dog stopped in her tracks. The group of teenagers playing catch exchanged looks, their postures shifting slightly, bracing for what they knew was coming. "You're loitering," Carlyle declared, voice edged with finality. "Park closes in an hour. You need to move." Still no reaction. Carlyle's grip on the baton tightened, his pulse quickening with the familiar rush of adrenaline. He had dealt with stubborn types before, people who thought they were above listening, above the law. He had never been afraid to remind them otherwise. A beat passed, then another. "Get up," Carlyle ordered. Jean-Claude did not. The refusal was not loud, not violent, but it was deafening. The tension in the air became unbearable, suffocating, as Carlyle's knuckles whitened around the baton. The silence stretched too long, and Carlyle, a man who thrived on control, would not allow this moment to slip further from his grasp. The decision was made the sun sets over a peaceful park where people enjoy their evening without a care in the world. But one man's quiet moment is about to turn into something unexpected. A routine patrol, an officer with unchecked authority, and an encounter that no one saw coming. What happens when power meets someone who doesn't need to prove their strength? Stay with us to witness a moment that will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories. The late afternoon sun cast long golden rays over the park, illuminating the winding paths and tall oak trees that line the area. The soft hum of life filled the air. Children laughing near the playground, joggers moving rhythmically along the paved trails, and the occasional bark of a dog chasing a frisbee. Among the scattered park-goers sat a lone man on a weathered wooden bench near the base of an old oak tree. His presence was quiet, yet somehow commanding, as if he belonged there as much as the tree itself. Jean-Claude Van Damme, clad in dark athletic pants and a fitted gray hoodie, exuded an effortless stillness. His sharp eyes scanned the park, though he wasn't searching for anything in particular. He was merely present, enjoying a rare moment of solitude. A small protein bar rested in his calloused hands, which he methodically broke apart, scattering tiny pieces at his feet where a cluster of pigeons eagerly pecked at the crumbs. His expression was neutral, not smiling, not frowning, just existing. Years of discipline, training, and battle had sculpted his body into a weapon. Yet here he was simply a man at rest. He had no opponent, no cameras, no crowd chanting his name. Only the warm breeze and the soft rustling of leaves. However, even in peace, there was something beneath the surface, a tightly wound energy, coiled and waiting. He was not looking for trouble, but should trouble find him, he would meet it as he always had. The rhythmic peace of the park was interrupted by the sound of deliberate, heavy footsteps cutting through the ambient noise. They were measured, unhurried, yet demanding attention. The thud of polished boots striking pavement belonged to someone who expected to be obeyed. The presence of the man carrying those steps was felt before he was seen. Officer Brent Carlisle was a tall, imposing figure wrapped in a meticulously pressed LAPD uniform. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the world in cold, impersonal fragments, his expression unreadable beneath them. His square jaw was set, lips pressed into a firm line of authority. His belt clinked softly with the weight of his tools, a baton, handcuffs, a taser, and the unmistakable bulk of a standard-issue firearm. Carlisle moved with the confidence of a man who had long since learned that the world responded to force. Over the years, he had molded his authority into something more than duty. It was a tool, a weapon to keep order as he saw fit. He thrived on obedience and expected it without question. As he patrolled the park, his eyes scanned over the crowd, sorting people into silent categories. Joggers, harmless. Families with children, harmless. Couples on benches, harmless. But then, his gaze landed on the solitary man beneath the oak tree. Something about him struck Carlisle as wrong. He wasn't doing anything illegal, but he wasn't running, wasn't picnicking, wasn't walking a dog. He was simply sitting, too still, too self-contained. In Carlisle's experience, people who lingered alone in public spaces were either loiterers or troublemakers. His lips curled slightly in distaste. He had encountered men like this before, the ones who carried themselves with too much confidence, as if they were untouchable. The ones who didn't flinch under his gaze, who didn't immediately shift, look away, or offer explanations. Carlisle enjoyed correcting those kinds of people. Veering off the main path, he adjusted his stride, heading straight for the bench. The sound of his boots striking pavement sharpened, announcing his approach with deliberate intent. His fingers grazed the handle of his baton, not out of need but out of habit, an unspoken promise that he would use it if given cause. A woman walking her dog slowed her pace, eyes flicking between the officer and the man on the bench. A group of young men playing catch exchanged glances, recognizing the subtle warning signs of an impending confrontation. They had seen Carlisle work before.